Today's daf, Be'ezras Hashem, is Masechta Menachos Daf Lamed Tes, and we will begin from Lamed Ches, 38b, 3 lines from the bottom. Okay, so the Gemara begins, Amarava, right over here. Amarava. Rava said, Shmamina, from what we discussed until now, we see a new halacha. Halacha is like this: Tzarich lichshar al kol chulya v'chulya. When you make your tzitzis, you have to tie a knot on every single set of windings. That's, you see, as you can see in the picture, in every set of windings, there's a new knot. Because the Gemara said before that if you cut one of the strings, the tzitzis is okay. And if you cut a few strings, the tzitzis is still okay. But the Gemara assumes that when you're going to cut a few strings, the knot is going to come apart. So if you only needed one knot, you do the windings, and then you do one knot at the end. And then the Gemara says that if you would cut the strings, the tzitzis will still be okay. How could the tzitzis be okay? That one knot, this one knot, as you can see, if this was the only knot, then once you cut the strings and you really untie this knot, then the whole tzitzis will fall off. So it must be that there's a din to put knots at the end of every wind. That's what the Gemara just said. So and every set of windings you have to make a knot. If you're going to think that you don't have to, the sons of Reb Chia said, Gardume and if you cut just the tchelis, the 4 strings of tchelis, al kosher, so you cut the tzitzis, you cut 4 of the strings, right, up until the end. So then it's kosher, because, kivin the ishtire le aloi, by doing that, you already just undid the bottom knot, right? Eloi means the bottom knot, the way we're counting it, the bottom knot, the end knot. And if there's no other knots on this tzitzis, ishtire le kula, then the whole thing is going to fall apart, and all the whole strings are going to fall out of the hole. So how could it still be kosher? Answers the Gemara, no, maybe you're right. If that was the case, then it would not be kosher. But Dilma, when did we say that it's kosher? The iktar, you happen to have tied other knots, then it's kosher. But if you didn't tie other knots, you don't have to do it. But if you didn't tie other knots and you cut the tzitzis, you cut the tchelis, it would not be kosher because it's going to fall out of the hole. Yama Rava. Shmamina, we can see from our Gemara, Kasha Elian Deraisa. The final, you have to make one knot. You can't just stick your tzitzis through a hole, make windings, and then say, okay, I made my tzitzis. You have to have at least one knot. And that firmly connects the tzitzis to the garment. The Isal Kadaita Rabbanan, if you're going to only say that the kesher is only there midrabanan, right? My istrech le lemishrei saden betzitzis. Why do we need a special pasuk to tell you that you could put wool tzitzis in a linen garment? Why? If you never needed to tie a knot in the first place, all the Torah required you was to stick the strings through the hole and just wrap it around a little bit. So then, of course, it's not a shotness. So and pshita, because hatoikif tchifa achas ein chibor. If you're going to stick one string, as you can see in this picture over here, if you take thamar, the picture, and you take a pishton and you take thamar, you put a string through them, that's not shotness. So why would the Torah go out of its way, tell you, oh, shotness, if you put wool tzitzis strings on a linen garment, there's no problem of shotness. There isn't any problem of shotness, because if minat Torah, you don't have to tie it together, certainly there's no problem of shotness. From here you can see that it is midaraisa, you need to tie at least one knot. Oma Rabba Barav Ada, Oma Rav Ada, Oma Rav, Im Nifsa Hachut Mi'ikoroi, Pesula. So if one of the strings where it connects, just one of the strings, right over here, where it connects, you see the picture over here, one of the strings where it connects into the hole got severed. So right over here, it got severed, then just one of the strings would passel the whole tzitzis. Yosef Rav Nachman v'Kamal Lahoshmaitza, Rav Nachman said over this teaching of Rav. So Esrei Rav Nachman. So Rav asked a question for Rav Nachman. The Brisa seems to disagree with that. When does it, the Brisa says, when does the tzitzis have to be non-severed? Is only when you first make the tzitzis. Aval b'soifoi. If somehow you wear the tzitzis for a long time, so that the Brisa says, Shiyar of whatever remnant, the gardum of whatever is cut, kol shehu, no matter what, it's going to be kosher. So my Shiyar of my gaduva, what does the Brisa mean if it's severed or left over? My love, Shiyar of dipsik minayu. When the Brisa says Shiyar of means a little bit was cut, the strings were cut. Vishtaya minayu, but you still have a little left. And then the Brisa says gardumov, it was totally cut. The gardume, what the Brisa maybe means that it got all the way cut, even by where it connects to the garment, like in the illustration. And so the Brisa says if you cut it over here, it's kosher, and even if you would cut it on the top, it would also be kosher. So isn't this Brisa disagreeing with the teaching of Rav? Answers the Gemara, loy. Severed by the top is always going to be possible. Chada Katani, just telling you one din. Shiorav gardumov kol shehu. That when you sever something, a little bit of the string has to remain. Says the Gemara, V'lemi gardumov. Let it just say you just severed the string. What is shiorav lomali? Why does it say something has to remain? When you cut the string, if they got severed and cut, you need to have a drop left. Like you could see a kenei aniva, so that you could make a slip knot on it, on itself. But if it's totally severed to the bottom, then it's not kosher. So never, if it's cut where over here by the top where it connects to the garment, if even one string is cut, it's no good. And even the bottom, you could have 4 strings cut, as long as there's a little, like an inch or two remaining. So then it's still kosher. New Gemara. Yosef Rabba v'Ka'ama Mishmeid Rav. Rabba said a teaching in the name of Rav. The winding, you put 4 strings into a hole, right? Fold them over, and now you have 8 strings. Then you take one and you do a winding. So you don't have to put an extra string to do the winding. The one that's going to do the winding can be counted as one of the 4 or one of the 8. Now, who said this teaching? Rav said this teaching. Amalei Rav Yosef, Shmuel Amara v'lo Rav. Shmuel actually said this teaching, and not Rav. So Rav Yosef corrected Rabbah. Itmaname. So we have this teaching in the name of other people. Amar Rabba Baba Chana said, Sachli Rav Yoshi de Usha. I had a conversation with Rav Yoshia from Usha, and he said, the string that does the wrapping could be counted as one of the strings. You don't have to get a separate string for that. Now, Yosef Rabba said another teaching, the name of Shmuel, that means that normally a tzitzis, if you look at a tzitzis, we're going to have 1/3 of the length of the strings is windings and knots, and 2/3 of the strings should be hanging strings. 2/3 should be hanging strings. What happens in this case? Somebody made the windings. He made the windings 2/3, and 1/3 the strings. So tchelis means tzitzis, by the way. Doesn't mean the blue strings, but a pair of tzitzis, shekarach ruba, that most of it is winding and knots, and just a little bit of strings. Let's say 1/3 of the length is strings and 2/3 is knots. That's kshera. It's not the nice way to do it. Like I said before, you have to do 1/3 knots and windings and 2/3 strings. Omalei Rabbi Yosef, who said this teaching? You said, Rabbah said in the name of Shmuel, Amalei Rav Yosef, Rav Amar, Rav said it, v'lo Shmuel. In this case, he got it wrong. Rav said it, not Shmuel. It Mename, Amar Rav Huna, Bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshes, Amar Rav Yirmiyah, Bar Abba, Amar Rav. This was Rav said it. Keilah Shcharach Ruba Kashera. A tzitzis that has mostly windings and knots in the length is still going to be kosher. Rav Chia bereid Rav Nasa Masni Hachi Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Sheshes Amar Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba Amar Rav Keilah Shcharach Ruba Kashera, which is exactly what we said before. Even if you just made chulya, you should know this is a term, means a set of windings. Even if you only made one set of windings, it's kosher. We have in our sets, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of windings, and then a knot at the each end of each set. But 1, 2, 7, 8, 11, 13, right? So that's what we do. But even if you have just one set of windings, it's still going to be kosher. The noyet chelas, and the nice way to make tzitzis is shlish gedil, is 1/3 windings and knots. Ushnei shlishi anaf, and strings should be 2/3. Anaf means strings. Gedil is windings and knots. So 1/3 windings and knots, 2/3 strings. The kama shir chulya, and what is called a set of windings? How many windings do you do? Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, Rabbi Yoma, 3 windings. Kadesh yichrach v'yishna v'yishalish. You have to do 1, 2, 3, and then that's considered one set. Now, how many sets do you have? How many sets of windings do you have? So, Tana, we learned in the Brisa, you shouldn't have less than 7 sets of windings. And you shouldn't have more than 13 sets of windings. So the minimum is 7 sets. Now, we do 4 sets, right? We do 4 sets of windings. But the Gemara says you should have really 7 sets of windings. But we count the airspace in between as something. So if you count it, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of windings, then the bottom one. But then you also have like the 3 air spaces in between. So maybe that's 7. But really, Medina de Gemara, if you're going to make a tzitzis made out of tchelas and wool, you should have 7 sets of windings minimum, but not more than 13. Hapoiches le'yivches meshava. Keneged shiva rakiyim. You shouldn't have less than 7 sets of windings because that corresponds to the 7 different types, 7 heavens. And if you don't have, you shouldn't have more than 13 sets of windings. Why 13? Keneged shiva rakiyim. You'll have 7 for the 7 skies. Shiva avirim b'neim, and there's 7 air spaces, the 6 air spaces in between 7 heavens. So therefore, you get the total of 13. We do 5 knots. We do 5 sets of knots. Rashi says because the tzitzis is gematria, it represents all the mitzvahs, and tzitzis is the gematria of tzitzis is 600. Then you have 8 strings, and then you have 5 knots. As you can see, you have 5 knots: 1, 2, 3, 4. And then 1 on the top, which is a 5th knot when you tie it to the baguette. So you have 5 knots, 8 strings, and you get 613. So therefore, but even though the Gemara says you should have 7 sets of windings, Taisa says since we don't have tchelas, we're not makbid on this thing, onto having 7 sets. So now the Gemara continues. Tanu, we learned in the Brisa, when you start your tefillin, when you start your tzitzis, you put 2 long strings, you set aside 2 long strings to do 1 white string and 1 blue string to do the windings. So the first winding, shumaschil, when you start the windings, maschil beloved, the first winding should be done with the white strings. Because hakanaf, min kanaf, the Torah tells you, use something that has the same color as the garment itself. Again, most garments were white, so you start your windings first with with something that has the same color as the garment. When you finish, Messiah Belavan, then you finish off with the white winding, because it's like, since the white strings, according to Rashi, are more important, not more holier, but more important than the blue strings, because the Torah first tells you that the first thing is you make the strings the same color as the garment. So we see that the Torah considers that more important. Therefore, you start with the white, you mix it up, then you continue on with the blue wrappings, and then you conclude with the white. Now the Gemara tells us a story. Rabba Baba Chuna, Yasri, they were sitting. Rabba and Rabba Baba Chana were sitting. Hava Kacholav Ozlahu Gavra the Mechase Glima de Kulit Chelta. That a person passed by and he was wearing a item of clothing that was tchelis. That was the whole clothing, was the whole beged was made out of blue wool. And he was wearing tzitzis, but we go to Beis Ugduli Migdal. It was only windings and knots, but no strings hanging. So it's funny. He had no strings hanging. Let's see if I have a picture of it. So he basically, no, I don't have a picture of it, but basically he had no strings hanging. So just the windings and knots. So Rabba Baba Chana, Rav said, Yoy Glima v'lo yoy chelta. He has a nice clothing, but he has no nice tzitzis. Rabba Baba Chana, Yoy Glima v'yoy chelta. The tzitzis is kosher also, even if it was just made out of windings and knots. So b'mai kami palvi, what are they arguing about? The Rabba Baba Chana Sava Gidil Uksipsil. Rabba Baba Chana says you have to have Gidil. Gidil is the windings and knots, and the Torah also says have strings. Oy Gidil, you could have it either windings and knots, or psilu, you could have it all the tzitzis, just strings. Rav Saval Oilam Silbini. You're always going to need strings, hanging strings. Vahi, the Torah wrote Gedilim that it has to be. The Torah wrote Gedilim knots to tell you how many strings you should have. Liminyana Huda Asa, because Gedil is a wrapping of two strings. So that's Shnayim. When the Torah says Gedilim Tasalacha, it means that you have to have 4 strings. Say Gedil Upaislehu Mitoichai. First, what the Torah is basically saying, you stick in 4 strings, and that's just the string that you're going to do the wrapping could also be one of the strings that are going to be hanging. But that's it. But you need both. In order to make a kosher tzitzis, you have to have windings and knots, and then you have to have strings hanging. That's why Rav said he wasn't yotze the mitzvah of tzitzis. Both agreed he had a nice garment, and we see from there that it's important to have a nice garment for your tzitzis, because it's a mitzvah, and especially nowadays, we use our talis as a davening garment, so therefore it should be, of high quality. Du Gemara. Amar Shmuel Mishmei de Levi. Shmuel said in the name of Levi, Chute Tzemar Poitrim B'Shel Pishtan. If, let's say you have a linen clothing, okay? So the Torah tells you put in blue strings, right? So the blue strings made of wool. So already the Torah is giving you the permission to put shatnez in your linen garment. But can I make the white strings also? Question is, can I make the white strings also of blue, or do I have to make the white strings of linen? So to minimize the shatnez, so to speak. So Levi said, yes, you can make the white strings out of wool, and even though the garment is made of linen. So now the Gemara asks, what about the reverse? Let's say you have a wool garment, so you're going to have blue wool tzitzis. Fine. No shatnez. Can the white tzitzis be made out of linen? Because in this situation, the Torah did not give you the license, so to speak, to put shatnez. So maybe tzema b'shel pishta, and the Torah says a blue wool, a wool with a linen garment, hu de patar. Then you could use the white strings made out of wool. Even the chelis potter, lavanami potter. Since you're anyway using blue wool tzitzis, blue wool strings, so you can use white wool strings. But maybe if the garment is made out of wool, you can't use white linen strings. Idilma, maybe it's the whole thing is suspended. Even the ksiv, since the pasuk says, Torah tells you shatnez is prohibited, but make tzitzis. I don't care how you make this tzitzis. Even if you're going to put wool in a linen garment or linen in a wool garment, where you don't really have to, but you put linen in a wool garment, is that permitted? Tashma, come in here. Amar Rachava, Amar Rabbi Huda, Chutei Sema Poitrim B'Shel Pishtan, V'Shel Pishtan Poitrim B'Shel Sema. Here clearly, if the garment is made out of wool, you're going to put blue wool tzitzis, but you could also put, you don't have to have white wool tzitzis, you could put linen tzitzis. You can put white linen tzitzis. Now the Gemara discusses another thing, and this was Rachva continuing in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. If you have strings made of wool or linen, no matter what the garment is made out of, it's kosher tzitzis. Even if you have a garment made out of silk, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's obligated in tzitzis, you don't have to make the tzitzis out of silk, you can make it out of linen and wool. Upligid the Rav Nachman, but Rachva and Rabbi Yehuda argued on Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, Hashiroyim Peturim Min HaTzitzis. That Rachva, that a silk garment is potter, is exempt from tzitzis. Esvei Rav Nachman. So Rav asked a question, Rav Nachman, what do you mean a silk garment is potter from tzitzis? We learned in a brisa, Hashiroin, if a silk garment, haklach is a fish garment, vahasrikin is a garment made out of ne'orish shel masi, I'm not sure, but clearly Shiroin, kulan chayav tzitzis, that's all obligated tzitzis. And says the Gemara midrabanan. That brisa is saying that only midrabanan is chayav tzitzis. Rabbi Nachman agrees midrabanan is chayav tzitzis, but midoraisa, a silk garment, is not chayav tzitzis, because in the Chumash, a garment means wool or linen, wool or linen, but not silk. So therefore, the Torah never obligated you to put tzitzis in a silk garment. Only midrabanan we require it. If that's the case, let's see this end of the brisa. Bekula and Samra Pishrun Poitrim. Brisa says, even a silk garment, you could put wool and linen tzitzis. Yama Bishlomi Deraisa Hainu de Mishtaribu Kalayim. Then, if you say that what the Gemara understood is that you could put, even if the garment was made out of silk, you could put 2 strings of wool, like the blue tchelis, and the white strings could be of linen. Wait a second. If you're going to tell me that a silk garment is chayv and tzitzis, that's why I can make the tzitzis linen and wool. But if you're going to say it's only chayv drabanan, how was I allowed to put in this linen garment a wool and linen tzitzis? That's klayim, and it's not obligated in a Torah a silk garment in tzitzis. And says the Gemara, you're right. The brisa means to say oitzemer oipishtin. You could put either wool, either all the strings were made out of wool, or all the strings of made out of linen. If the garment is silk, you don't have to use silk tzitzis. You can make or total wool strings or linen strings, but you can't mix them. And hachinami mistavid, that makes sense. The brisa, the Ketani Seifa, the brisa says, "Hey, b'minam poitrim, shloi b'minam ein poitrim." A silk tzitzis, if it's a silk garment, then that's good. But a silk tzitzis in, like, say, a wool garment, it won't be good. Yamer pishla midrabonam. If you're going to say that's chayiv and tzitzis midrabonam, hainu mifter minam. That's why silk tzitzis in a silk garment works. El yamer daraisa. If you're going to say that a silk garment is chayiv in daraisa, Semer Pishnu Depatra. Doesn't the Torah require that the tzitzis, the strings, have to be made from wool and linen? Isn't that what the Torah required you? So the Gemara understands now that the actual string can only be made of wool and linen. So how could you tell me that if the garment is silk, the strings can be made out of silk? And says the Gemara, no, because Rava said that the truth is, midaraisa, you could use any strings for tzitzis. The Ravi Rami ksiv hakonof, min konof. Torah tells you that the tzitz strings have to be made out of the same material as the garment. Uksiv, Samar Pishtan. Then the Torah tells you the string should be either wool or linen, or wool and linen. Okay, so how do you resolve that? Samar Pishtan, a wool and linen garment, a wool and linen strings, it doesn't matter what the garment is made out of, that exempts from tzitzis. Tzitzis, the strings could be made out of wool and linen. Sharminam, but when it comes to a garment made out of any other type of material, like silk, so biminam paitrin. Only if you're making a silk tzitzis, then it's exempt. Shloi biminam ein paitrin. If you make a cotton tzitzis for a silk garment, then it's not going to work. So the Torah never meant that you should only use wool and linen strings. Wool and linen strings is the universal strings, but if you can use strings that are made from the same material as the garment itself, and that's what the Torah is telling you. The bottom line is, Rav Nachman held, nevertheless, that although you don't have a raya from this brisa, and the Gemara wanted to say maybe there is a raya, and first the Gemara thought it was a question, then the Gemara reverses it, maybe it could be a proof. Rav Nachman's opinion is Hashiroyim Peturim in tzitzis, that a silk garment, the Torah never required silk garments to have tzitzis, because when the Torah talked about garments, it was always referring to garments made out of wool and linen. Rav Nachman, Tana debate Rabbi Shmuel, Rav Nachman, he links like what Rabbi Shmuel said by nega. Hoyel v'nega begodim b'taristam upar l'chol be'echamem tzemer pishtan afkol tzemer pishtan. Since the Torah said that the Torah says garments, but then the Torah defines one garment by negoim. It says beged semer or beged pishtan. So we see that wherever the Torah says beged garment, the Torah only had in its mind, so to speak, a wool or linen garments, but not something made out of silk. So when the Torah says tzitzis is required on a four-corner garment, it was only referring to a wool or a linen garment, not a silk one. But that was the teaching of Rabbi Shmuel. But there was another teaching of Rabbi Shmuel, argued from another version of what it was said in the yeshiva Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana Bei Rabbi Shmuel, that beged ainly el beged semem and ayl rabbis sema gamalim and sema novim noitz shel izem vakala v'srigim shuraim. Other materials of begadim, how do I know, are included in the concept of nega for a garment? How do I know that? Because the Torah says beged semer oi beged pishtan. But how do you know to include others? So because the answer is because the pasuk says oi tamad loima oi beged, right? There's an oi. So that oi, as any material of beged, is involved with the concept and the parsha of nega of a beged. So since we already see, according to this Tana Rebbe Shmuel, the Torah, when it refers to a garment, could refer to a garment made of any type of material. So that is not that Tana Rebbe Shmuel is not the Tana Rebbe Shmuel that Rav Nachman linked his opinion on, that silk garments are exempt from tzitzis. Okay, we stopped here and we finish Bez Hashem, Daf Lamed Tes. Shabbos.